want to get in touch with me, that's great. Let me go ahead and introduce Dr. Stein. How are we doing on the line? Yeah, we're doing all right. Let me go ahead and introduce Dr. Stein in communication studies. We formed a pretty good partnership. It was one of the first, before I became director of the Institute of Politics, this was one of the first events I went to. And Dr. Stein puts on what's known as civil dialogue, and he'll explain that to you a little bit more. And so we've been trying to do one of these each semester on difficult topics. And I see some of my students out there. By the way, if you want to get credit for this, just take a picture and send it to me. But I was very impressed with how he was able to deal with difficult issues. And this is one of those today. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Stein. If you would give him a warm welcome, I'd appreciate it, and let him do his thing.
Hi, I'm just going to stand up here if that's okay with you all. I know that's a little close for some folks, but we're going to be talking about very, very intimate topics today regardless, so we might as well get to know each other. So for those of you who do not know me, yes, my name is Dr. James B. Stein. I'm here in the communication department, and like Vince said, we do this once a semester, and we talk about difficult topics in these civil dialogue discussions. So this is the way it's going to work. I'm first going to explain what civil dialogue is, what the goals of it are, and what we're seeking to accomplish here today. Then I'll give a little, as you can see, I have a little presentation ready for you all. I'll give my little spiel. We'll talk about the topic of the day. And at the end of that, I'm going to present a provocative statement. And what we'll find is that I'm going to be asking you all to speak on this issue. I'll talk more about that in a minute. But that's the lowdown. The whole thing will take about 45 minutes, and I promise you it'll go by very, very fast. Time flies when you're discussing controversial issues. So, with that said, are we ready to get started?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you for like the one person in the back giving the applause. We are ready to go. I can tell. I can see the excitement. It is reverberating throughout the room. So let's begin by talking about what civil dialogue is, because that is needed and necessary. Now, surely we're all familiar with the concept of a debate. When we debate something, a topic and a series of questions are presented. One side presents one perspective, the other side, well, they present a different perspective, and at the end of it, there's usually some sort of judge, be it an official moderator or just the court of public opinion. And they assign a winner and a loser, and that's basically how debate works. Civil dialogue operates as an alternative to debate. So if you look behind me, you're going to see we have not 2 chairs, but 5. I'll explain those 5 chairs in just a moment. But first, just to put a bow on the difference between civil dialogue and debate. In debate, the goal is to win. It's not the goal here. We have 2 goals when we do a civil dialogue. The first, mutual understanding. What does that mean? It means that we're not here to change the minds of other people per se. Minds may be changed, and that's cool. People may also stay exactly in the positions that they had when they entered today, and that's also cool. The idea is not to convince the other person that you are right. The idea is to be heard and to hear. Right? So we're going to try to avoid some of the tendencies that we have to listen for response. We call that the rebuttal tendency. We're going to try and avoid that, and instead we're going to try and adopt a perspective where we listen with our whole heart when folks speak on these issues. So that's goal number 1. Goal number 2 is civility. And I know that that's a word that gets tossed around a lot. So what do we mean when we say civility? In the context of today's event, what we mean is that we're going to respect the right that other people have to exist. And what this means is that if your perspective exists in such a way that it attempts to remove that right from another person, that sort of thing won't be tolerated. So civility exists in so much as we respect, appreciate, and admire each other. And that's the second goal of today's dialogue. So what that means is that we're going to have to be extremely understanding and empathetic toward people with whom we would normally disagree. I'm trusting you all to do that. Never have I been let down before. So, how does it work? Well, like I said, in a moment here, I'm going to give a 5-minute long presentation, and that will end with a highly provocative statement concerning trans student athletes. That's our topic for the day. Now, as you hear this statement, you may feel a certain way about it. In fact, the statement is designed to make you feel a certain way. So, if you look at these chairs here, you may strongly disagree with this statement. Okay? These are double-sided, so you may strongly disagree, but you may just disagree, and that's okay too. You can somewhat disagree, and there's another option here for disagree. On the other end, you might strongly agree with the statement, or you could just, regular old agree. You may somewhat or plain old agree with the statement. And then in the middle, we've got the neutral corner. So you may be neutral, but you also may be undecided. And I just want to take a second to explain the difference between those two. When you're neutral, you feel like you've got enough information on the topic, and you kind of know what's going on, but you're in between. When you're undecided, this is an indication that you feel like maybe you don't have enough information on the topic, and as such, you're not ready to pick a side. So that's the distinction between neutral and undecided, and that will be important for the person who ends up sitting in that chair, because after the statement is delivered, I will ask 5 of you in this audience to come and represent one of these chairs. So what we'll have is 5 people sitting here. Those 5 people will discuss the statement, and only the statement, for anywhere between 5 to 10 minutes, depending on how the conversation goes. And at the end of that 5 to 10 minutes, we'll then get the audience involved. So let's say that you weren't feeling courageous enough to come sit in a seat in front of several dozen people, and that's totally fine. But maybe you have a thought that occurred to you during the conversation, and you want to voice that thought. Well, we'll have 5 to 10 minutes of audience participation as well. And at that time, audience members can interact with the 5 volunteers, or just give their thoughts, or interact with each other. Then, we'll give a quick little wrap-up, and then we'll be done. Again, it's going to go by quickly. How do we feel about the rules and regulations surrounding the event? Feeling good? Yeah. Okay, I was not expecting applause for that one. That's okay. All right, so in that case, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started, and then I'm going to be sitting in this chair right here. Y'all won't see me. The only purpose that I have to serve is to, 1, make sure that each of our 5 participants have roughly equal speaking time, and 2, to make sure that we adhere to the topic at hand and that we stay within our time frame. One other little thing, there may be an issue in which somebody brings up a fact or a date or a statistic that requires checking. If so, Dr. Brown has volunteered to be our fact checker for this one. Every now and then we'll need his services, but we'll see how that goes. So you won't hear a ton from me after this, other than to say something like, oh, hey, I notice our neutral seat hasn't spoken a whole lot yet. Let's see if we can get that person involved. You may hear that from me, but other than that, it's up to the volunteers. So, make sure my clicker's on, and let's get started. So, as you all know, today's discussion is about trans athletes, and this is specifically in relation to a piece of legislation that just passed recently. We'll get to that in just a moment. But first, a little bit of background here. I'll try to get out of the way of these screens so that everybody can see. I want to begin by talking from a scholastic standpoint. There is research that has demonstrated that the concepts of biological sex, or what some might call assigned sex, is constructively and conceptually different from what we now call a person's gender identity. Because of this, there's been a lot of mounting discourse surrounding the topic. And of course, this discourse exists on a spectrum of opinions. On one extreme end, we have people who understand the difference between these two things, and on the other hand, we have people who aren't necessarily on board with there being a difference between assigned sex and gender identity. And that has, of course, led to an ongoing discussion about what it means to be a trans person, especially here in the United States. Now, specifically as it pertains to sports, we've had much ado about discussion related to competitive athletes being trans. So, it's not the only issue we talk about regarding trans people, but it is the issue that we are talking about today. So, well-known athletes like Chris Moshier, who I hope I'm pronouncing that name correctly, Lashia Calderon, and Fallon Fox are some well-known examples of professional athletes who are trans, who have been thrust into the spotlight because of their trans status as an athlete. Now, these conversations about pro athletes have now bled into a larger discourse surrounding youth trans athletes, right? And this is, of course, a much bigger issue because professional athletes represent a very, very tiny percentage of our population, but youth represent a very large portion. of our population. And as such, this conversation has become extremely important, and that is what we will be discussing today. Now, before we go any further, it's important to note that when we talk about trans people, specifically trans kids who are athletes, there are some existing there's existing precedent in terms of what the process of transitioning looks like. For example, transitioning doesn't necessarily mean just simply changing one's clothes. There are additional options like hormone replacement therapy, there's surgery, there's physical, psychological therapy. These are all quite common in the experiences of trans youth and trans adults for that matter. But as you can see, I'm shifting our conversation to youth because that's what we're talking about today. So the reason it's called transitioning is, of course, because it is a process, and often it's a lengthy process. And it's worth noting that the two largest organizations in sport, the Olympics and the NCAA, both have policies as it relates to transgender athletes. Now, we can get into the weeds with the discussion of that, but basically, trans athletes are required to document their hormone levels at a series of predetermined times before they are allowed to compete in sports. So, this can set precedent for the conversation that we are about to have, because when it comes to K through 12 students, there's a lot more nuance. And I'll explain that nuance in just a moment here. For example, there's a big difference between competing in sports professionally and competing in sports at the youth level. First of all, if you're a professional athlete, you're probably getting paid. The goal of professional sports, much like debate, is to win. And there's also zero-sum participation, in so much as you're not only competing against the other team, but you're competing against your fellow team members for a seat on that team. On the other hand, youth sports recognizes that we're dealing with kids first and athletes second. And as a result, the goal of youth sports, above all other things, is mostly to socialize children, to teach them about discipline, to teach them about teamwork, to introduce them to friends, and to get them feeling comfortable with shared responsibility and activities. And to that end, usually, especially in younger situations, everyone has a spot on the team. If you don't make varsity, you can play JV. If you don't make JV, you can play on the freshman team. Right? So usually there's a spot for everyone, and in rare instances, some people just don't make the team point blank. But I bring this up because of the discussions that often surround trans athletes and trans kids in terms of trans athletes winning and trans athletes taking the spot of cisgendered athletes. So, with this distinction in mind, we must consider Utah House Bill 11, which passed on February 17th of this year. And the bill essentially mandates that K through 12 students must participate in gender-designated sports aligned with their unamended birth certificate, meaning that the sex that you were assigned at birth now dictates the sport that you are allowed to play in. Right? So this is, of course, put forward by people who have concerns about trans athletes competing in school-sanctioned athletics. A recent survey from the Trevor Project found that these laws that are being put into place, not just here in Utah, but across the country, are negatively affecting the psychological and even physical health of up to 85% of trans kids. So it's a big deal. Now, advocates for the bill argue that trans girls in sports place cis girls at risk of injury and create unfair competition. Often absent is the discussion of trans boys, and I'll get to that in just a minute. But this is the pretext that we're working with, leading into our statement. So are we ready for our statement? I'm ready. You better be ready, because here it comes. The statement is, K through 12 students should participate in school-sanctioned sports in line with their gender identity. Now, this statement is designed to make you feel a certain type of way. You may strongly agree with the statement, you may strongly disagree with the statement, or you may fall somewhere in between. But there's a couple things about this statement that you'll notice. First, we're not here today to talk about the existence, the rights, or the validity of being trans. So that's a conversation for a different day. This conversation presupposes that trans kids exist and that their existence is valid and real. So that's what we'll be talking about today. Number two, you'll notice this has absolutely nothing to do with parents and the way that parents might choose to raise their child. Okay, so we're not here to talk about parenting. What we're here to talk about is the extent to which we believe that K through 12 students should participate in school-sanctioned sports that are in line with their gender identity. So, with that in mind, I will now ask for 5 volunteers to populate one of these 5 seats, ranging from strongly agree to strongly disagree. And before I ask for those volunteers, I will say this. You are allowed to sit in a seat that does not overlap with your actual point of view. You can simply represent someone who might sit in that chair. Just wanted to make that clear. Cool? Okay, so then I will ask, at this time, is there a chair that is speaking to anyone? And if there is, please come up and claim it. All right, we've got 1 volunteer. Where do you stand on this issue? Neutral? So are you neutral or are you undecided? Neutral means undecided. Okay, so feeling like maybe we don't have necessarily enough information to make that decision. Cool. All right, so we've got our middle seat. Is there a chair speaking to anyone else? All right, we got another chair coming up here. Where do we stand here? Somewhat agree or agree? Agree? All right, go ahead and take that chair. I'm going to ask y'all, I have some name tags here. If you could just write your names and then stick them somewhere on your person. Yeah, they're blank, so that's the side, yeah. All right, we need to fill 3 more chairs. What do we got?
I said if the student doesn't want to, but.
No, that would be great.
Okay, I'll just go.
Come on up. Where do we stand here? Are we strongly disagree or disagree? Strongly disagree it is. Okay, and one more? Coming up? Where are we here? Agreed. One more? So your only option is to either somewhat disagree or bring on all disagree. All right, if you all could please, 1, pass those name tags around and get your names on them. And then 2, just hold your seat label in such a way that you and the audience doesn't forget where you stand. I need my clipboard. All right, well, let's really quickly, this is a difficult conversation, so can we just encourage our volunteers and give them a round of applause? Very difficult to talk about this subject. Okay, so as you all write your names down, I'll just give you a quick reminder as to how things are going to work. I'm going to sit in this chair and mind my own business while the 5 of you talk. We're going to begin with opening statements. Those should be anywhere between 30 to 45 seconds. Okay? So tell me about why you chose the chair. And of course, give us your name. And then it'll be open conversation. 5 to 10 minutes, depending on how it goes. Then we'll get the audience involved. Then we'll take closing statements, and then I'll summarize, I think, what we've got here today. Sound good? Remember, I'm just here to make sure that everybody participates with relative similarity, so if you're not talking, I will call on you. All right? All right, without further ado, I see the last person writing their name, so why don't we start over here on the agree side. Please also check your mic is working. You may need to push the little button to turn it on. But go ahead and introduce yourself using your name and your pronouns if you choose, and then talk for 30 or 45 seconds about why you chose the chair that you chose.
Do I have to start? Can I gather my thoughts for a little bit?
Yeah, we can start on the other side if that's okay. All right, so let's do that. And just as a reminder, let's all make sure for our volunteers that we refer to other folks, if we're going to address them, that we refer to them by their names. So please, you may need to turn it off. I'm not sure. There we go.
Okay, thanks. So, I got, how long is it, by the way, again?
30 to 45 seconds.
Okay, so one person I met in my lifetime is Eunice Kennedy Shriver in Boston, and she actually started something called the Special Olympics. And she recognized that people have talents in different bodies. And so there's also the senior games that we hold here. We would never put a 20-year-old in the pitted against the 90-year-olds in the Senior Olympics, or maybe we would, because if that 20-year-old identifies as a 90-year-old, then they should be able to participate, right? And if you put someone who isn't a paraplegic in the paraplegic race in the Special Olympics, then they wouldn't be able to. Those that are paraplegic wouldn't be able to participate. So I actually love sports and swimming and running and competition. I think that it's important for kids to have that opportunity at the K through 12 level. I do also believe that I think it's just taking hormones is not going to change that outcome of a boy being a girl or a girl being a boy. The boy, I'm going to talk just specifically about boys because they do have in the general population an advantage. The fastest 20 high school times in Washington County would make them international level female athletes, if that puts you in perspective, in their mile times and in their 5K times. There's plenty that can run under a 14-minute 5K race. That totally annihilates women's sports. If you have a 20-year-old participating in the senior games, it totally annihilates the ability of a 90-year-old to participate in sports.
Next up.
Hello. Obviously, I'm nervous being here because I feel like having opinion in my position is unpopular, and so I feel oftentimes judged in what my opinion is. I know parenting is not part of this, but I have children in that age group that are active in sports, and I feel that obviously, like Hirsch, there needs to be an equal playing ground of wherever they. I agree. Everybody can identify where they want to be identified as. But I also feel that the playing ground needs to be equal, and where somebody's rights, I don't know if this is okay, but where somebody's rights kind of is fine by me until they inhibit another person's rights. And so once that, I know that they said that all children are able to get on sports and stuff like that, but when you get an older age, you are preparing for later on. And I know my brother-in-law, he pays a lot of money to train his children in sports because he wants them to have a professional experience eventually, or at least have an opportunity to do that. And I feel that if those slots are filled with unequal balance, then that is not a level playing field.
Next up.
Good, it's not just
We're over 3.
I'm December. So I picked undecided because this has been a topic that I've been like going back and forth with for a while. It's been probably like 2.5, 3 years since this topic actually came about, and it's been very hard for me to pick a side because I sympathize with both sides of the argument. So yeah.
Okay.
Hey, I'm Sarah. I'm the president of the LGBTQ club here on campus. The reason I chose this is, so I've always played sports. I played tackle football, I played swim team, I played soccer, and some of those have been on the boys team and the girls team. So I've played co-ed, I've played a bunch of different sports. And my sister is trans. I have grown up with trans people, and I have a very close connection with those individuals.
I'm Callie, she, her pronouns. I am looking at this as a perspective of I wrestled in high school, and I am a wrestling coach to all genders. And historically with wrestling, it has in the past been co-ed. There hasn't been separated between girls and boys wrestling. It's becoming much bigger these days, girls wrestling is, but I've coached kids that wrestle each other no matter what their identity is, and I've personally wrestled people no matter what their identity is, and I understand the point of view that injuries are higher, but I mean, you can do anything you want to, honestly, with a sport like wrestling. I mean, there's of course other things like running, for example, is a harder one to decide on. But from my perspective, I'm willing to say that I agree.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your opening statements. At this time, we're going to open up discussion for about 5 to 10 minutes of convo. And again, remember, my goal here is to just make sure that everybody gets relatively equal speaking time. So if I notice one person is speaking too much or not enough, you'll hear me chime in. Other than that, the floor is entirely yours. And if there's someone who wants to kick the conversation off, please feel free to do so.
One thing I was gonna mention is that I think that there could, which many people have mentioned as well, is that there could be different categories for transgender athletes, where whether it's oh my. So I don't know if you heard me, but that I advocate 100% every individual enrolled in a K through 12 program, and whether it's Washington County or anywhere in Utah or the country, or for that matter the world, should be able to participate in sanctioned sports and be able to get up that day and run and swim. But you do have talking about the female category, you have an advantage by being a physical male. You're generally going to be taller, better bone mass, bigger heart ratio for the cardiac. She kind of spoke to that with running, because you have the blood and lung capacity higher, even if you're taking those hormones. So with that, many have suggested to have a transgender category in cross-country races and swimming, whether you're the Yale student who transitioned from being a boy to a woman, or you're the woman who's now taking testosterone, which is another factor, I believe, where women can be taking testosterone and then competing at the women's sport in the NCAA level. So I do appreciate everybody being able to participate in sports, but to protect biological females, they should have one category, biological males, and then perhaps different categories for those transitioning from woman to male or male to female or whatever it might be.
So I have commonly heard that argument, and one thing that I was thinking about a while ago when I was studying this is my professor actually brought up that there was a woman in the Olympics who had biological, I think she had a vagina. Am I allowed to say something like that? I don't want to anyway.
You're probably talking about Caster Semenya, who is from South Africa, the 800-meter runner.
So the argument was brought up, should we test testosterone, should we test hormones, because basketball players are particularly tall. It's a tall sport, so for somebody who might be short, it's an unfair advantage. And so it's very hard, because if we say that the line is sex, then you are eliminating those people and you're not making it fair for those people. So in the same turn, it's just sports have an inequality. We have to figure out a way to make it equal. So I agree with you on that part.
Thank you. I was going to say that the Caster Semenya situation, I think they have the testicles that were undescended, if I'm not mistaken. And the actual chromosomes, though, I believe were I'm confused, I can't remember which was which, but they were female chromosomes, but he had the undescended testicles.
I think the important thing to remember here is that we are talking about children. And children develop at different rates, and they are still developing even as high school seniors. So by the logic of should we do it by what they were assigned at birth, should we also separate the height or the muscle mass or anything like that? It's kids. They grow and they develop at different rates and ages, and I mean, there's no way to make absolutely everything ever fair. So why are we so divided on this?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting in the presentation. We had how it affected the trans students was 85%, but there was no number for how it affected female students. And I would submit to our fact checker to find out that. I don't know if you can find it out, but how many female athletes are affected when they can't get scholarships or participate in what they've worked for.
Sorry. So I know that there are some outliers, and I think each exception of an outlier should be taken under consideration of what it is. But I believe it's hard to make an outlier the exception, the norm. And those exceptions should be reviewed and understood and evaluated. But then it brings up another subject of, okay, so these children are taking testosterone, or they may or may not, at what level. We exclude people who want to stay the same sex to be able to take those hormone replacements because it gives them an unfair advantage. So it opens, do we now allow people to choose to take extra hormones or steroids because they choose to heighten what they already choose to be? Or at what point is that okay and then it's not okay the other way? So I guess that's my question.
I think this is like a back and forth type of thing, and this is why I'm so undecided, because I don't want to seem biased by what I believe in the context of what trans youth actually go through, but I think these type of things have been going on forever, and I think this is like a fight for scarce resources right now, whereas you have trans youth that are trying to participate in sports, so possibly they can go off to college and possibly be able to afford an education. And I don't think it's right to actually sit here and say, well, 85% of trans youth affected by this law, but then compare it to how many biological female students are impacted by this law. Because if we being honest, trans youth probably have the most hardest time it is actually in educational systems. I don't think you can compare a trans woman experience on any type of school to a biological female going to school. It's two different types of experiences. In order to speak on it, I think you really have to be rooted in knowing what trans youth actually go through and the things that they actually experience. So, putting them into competition is kind of like very wrong, because they deserve the same type of opportunities that everybody else deserves.
Yeah, and I don't pit it against that. I just think that it should be something we also look at how it affects biological females, knowing that when they go into that race, they're not going to be on a fair playing field. That's all I'm saying. I 100% think transgender youth should have sports. They should wake up and have a sport, a track, and a swimming pool that they go to, locker accommodations that they want. But I also believe that women and girls in the K through 12, they may not want to share a locker room with someone with a penis, and that's fair, and a scrotum. I think that that's fair for them to say that they're not ready to see that in 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade. And I think we should consider those feelings.
So like I said, I played a lot of sports with males, and it didn't really affect me that as much as everybody thinks. I was on the swim team as well. I was in the same lane as a lot of guys. I would beat a lot of guys. I think that we always think that males are ahead of everyone, but I don't think it's that much of an advantage. Also, my sister, when I was playing sports with her, there was never an unfair advantage. We would play on sports teams together. We would play with others, trans individuals, and it wasn't something that they had the advantage of. We also have to recognize that these are children, and I don't think that, like, let's say that they are in kindergarten, for instance, like this is K through 12. I don't think that a kindergartner has, like, they haven't developed any muscle, they haven't developed anything. And so if you are looking at an individual who is so small and so young, it wouldn't make a difference.
Yeah, especially if we talking about, so like the lady said, we are talking about trans youth. So if a transgender youth is transitioning at an early age, their estrogen levels and testosterone levels are going to mimic a biological female. It is not that they are not going to mimic unless you start transitioning in later days of your life.
I do feel that that's like making an assumption about at what stage people are going to be doing their transitioning, and to feel that everybody's experience is the same is not going to happen, and there are going to be differences between people that do transition. It's just going to happen, and so it's hard to say that, oh, if we start all youth transitioning really young, then we'll all be equal. But in reality, most people decide to do the transitioning later on in life, and they've already developed quite a bit between now and then.
But I don't think we are talking. So what I, not what you said, but Karen, what you said pretty much is like isolation pretty much. And I feel like the only way as a society, the only way that we can grow is to implement inclusion everywhere. So in sports, in education, in career services, in career like everything, it should all be inclusive, not
Sure. In Title IX, 1972 was set up for women's sports in high school. It made a big difference in women's sports in high school. I've already- Yeah. You're good. So just real quick, in 1972 with Title IX, you would have been one of the very pioneer kind of women. You wouldn't have had a ton of competition. It took decades to build up women's sports. Trans athletes will have to do the same thing that biological women did in 1972 Title IX. There's a pathway there. And I think it goes back to having categories. That's why we have LGBT. There's a different gender. Is there not 72, 81 genders? Then we need to have 72, 81 sports categories. They're not going to, every individual will conform to male, female. So there's male, female, and then there's everything in between. And maybe that's what Utah and the high school sports teams need to do is set up those categories so everyone can compare.
Just kind of to hit on what I was saying before, if we want to do it for 72 different genders, then why don't we do it for different heights, different weights, different muscle mass, things like that? Where do we? Well, yeah, I know, but like different heights. I've wrestled kids half my size and they beat me, stuff like that. I got kicked off of the boys' practice team because I kept beating the boys. Sorry, humble brag, but I mean, like, where do you draw the line then? Because if we're going to talk about just I don't know, there's got to be a place where you stop at some point or a place where you start at some point.
Okay, well, that was definitely a very involved and very evenly spread conversation, and for that I appreciate it. At this time, we have a couple of dead mics that died on us, so I'm going to walk around. And if there's somebody from the audience who has thoughts or input, just raise your hand, and I'll come up. And I saw one hand right here, so we'll start here. And remember, you can address a comment to someone specifically, or you can just voice your own thoughts, and from there we'll kind of bounce around. So.
Okay, I'm Jordan. Hi guys, thanks for the conversation. I am a professional athlete at the moment, and obviously I'm not in K through 12 right now, but I grew up in the sport I'm doing right now, and it's not so much a conventional high school sport. I grew up racing BMX, which now I mountain bike, but I raced the boys growing up because there wasn't enough girls to make a class, and I had no issues up until about 11, 12 years old, and there was a significant change in all of a sudden all my friends could absolutely beat me, and I would train with them, do the exact same training as them, and they just started getting that male biological advantage of the increased bone mass, increased testosterone, and I just, at that point in a sport like what I was doing where it's so strength and power based, I had no chance. And future in racing, they would actually have an open class that you could choose to compete in, but there was a novice, intermediate, and expert category, and the expert girls would compete with the intermediate and novice boys, and they felt like that was a fair playing field, and it would really just go back and forth. There wasn't always girls or always boys winning, but the same age groups, if you put a 13-year-old girl with a 13-year-old boy, there was never an outlier. Like, there was not an insane 13-year-old girl who could ever beat them, unfortunately, because it was just so strength based. So I just think it's easy to look at some of the more conventional sports that don't have quite as many aspects, but sometimes looking at other sports can make a bit of a different perspective.
Thank you. Would anyone like to respond before we go to? Sure, go ahead.
So I had an idea. I don't know if it would work, but why can't we give choice to those of cisgenders, like whether or not they want to participate in a group that is okay with allowing transgender students in, like, and then have the group of male-female categories that they choose to be within their own groups. I guess should choice go both ways?
All right, another audience comment right here.
First, intersex people exist. It's about 1 in 1,000 births, and which is really important for K through 12 students. And remembering that that is the focus is K through 12 students. And as has been brought up, there is a huge natural variance among each specific gender through, and by gender I mean biological sex. And if we're concerned about leveling playing fields, then basing that on the individual's abilities, as was talked about with the squirt down at the end, that makes a lot more sense than basing it on sex.
Okay. Other audience thoughts?
Hello, everyone. My name is Kai. Well, I've had a lot of thoughts this entire time, but I think the thing that really impacted me the most is, we heard a lot about how this might impact cisgender females, but transgender youth especially, they already have a very hard time going through K through 12. And then here we are trying to exclude them from their gender identity. They're trying to figure out their gender identity. And in order to protect those people who know their gender identity well and are comfortable with it, to protect them, we're hurting them even more. And in a place where we preach equality and freedom, here we are taking it away from another group of people. And so that's just the main thing I wanted to say.
I would just respond back to defer to the 1972 Title IX, where categories were set up for women. So you have those categories, and that's what we're advocating here, to have categories for transgender. If that's what they did, instead of saying, women here, you join the men's team, if you're so good, you do that. They said, no, here's your category, here's your team. And I don't understand why it's so hard for to not set those transgender categories up.
All right, thank you. I'm sorry. Hi, I'm back here. we have another audience comment all the way back here.
Okay, my name is Adeline. I'm a student athlete here at the university, and I've played sports my whole life. And I think one thing that we're missing when we're talking about K through 12 and then the comparison to college athletes and professional athletes is that once you hit high school, that is setting you up to be a professional athlete and a collegiate athlete. And I know that once you get in NCAA, you have to do a year's worth of hormone therapy, and there's a lot of studies that I have that I can send to Vince that prove that it's actually 15 to 30% that keep their advantages after 1 year of hormone therapy, especially with muscle mass. But that's one thing to me, is that I played softball particularly. And if in high school, if I had a biological male competing against me, and we were looked at by colleges in the same way, they would win every single time. And I would go to bat for that because I played with the boys. And at that level and at that age, they would beat me every single time. No matter how hard I worked, I could work 15 times harder than them. And so I think that's something important, because, yeah, they're children, but the children age, they were talking about K through 12, that second you hit high school, you are preparing yourself to compete in college and professional sports. And so one thing to me is that in society right now, it's all about this female women empowerment. And to me, that feels like the complete opposite.
I agree. And I don't know if our fact checker can check, but again, look at Florence Griffin Flojo world records and compare that to the high school times of male athletes, of women, from the 400 meter to the 1600, or the 5K.
I just wanted to
Go ahead.
I just wanted to chime in because I feel like it's going to that side, so I just wanted to talk about the other side. I think we have to realize that there's not that many trans youth out there. If we made a category, there wouldn't be enough people to participate. And the people that we're saying, it's such a minority that you're saying that there might be one person that's going to be on the team in the entire high school that's going to be doing it. I don't think that you guys understand that there's not that many trans individuals in the high school, that it's not going to create that much of an unfair advantage.
Tell that to the girls in Connecticut track that were not able to, that were beaten by the two, and if you follow that at all.
That's why I think this conversation is so controversial, because I've heard so many wrong things, and I'm trying to keep it on topic. I'm trying my best. I really am. But it just seems like I'm just hearing a bunch of comparison of women versus men. We not talking about women versus, we not talking about biological women versus transgender women anymore. We're not talking about the process after they have started transitioning. We're not talking about estrogen levels, testosterone levels. You are comparing grown men to women.
No, that's high school. This is high school.
Yeah, but we
High
talk,
school
when
sports.
we talking about high school, we still talking about trans youth. You're not talking about trans youth. You're talking about male student athletes versus female student athletes,
In youth
not
sports.
trans.
No, these were trans in Connecticut. There were two trans male athletes that competed as girls in the girls' events, and they just annihilated all of the Connecticut sport records.
Okay,
So that's a K through 12.
so was it two trans men or was
No.
it two trans?
Two trans.
That's why I'm confused because you don't know the difference.
Oh, so they're
The thing is
initially
that-
were boys who are becoming girls.
Okay, so at the beginning of this, our wonderful host said, what's not up for debate is whether or not trans women are women. Trans women are women. We're not debating that.
All right, well, I feel like that's a natural stopping point. So, with that said, at this time, I would like to ask for closing statements of about 30 to 45 seconds from each person. You can use that time to explain why you're, if you've drifted in one direction or the other, why you've done that, or if you're sitting in the same seat as when we began, why that is as well. But we are running out of time, so let's make sure that we stay within those 30 to 45 seconds. And because we started on this end in the earliest bit, we're going to start over on this end in the later bit. Is that all right?
Sounds good.
Okay, so 30 to 45 seconds, if you would.
I think one of the things that we were hitting on here as far as kids in high school playing is that colleges are looking at them to recruit them, to give them scholarships or something like that. So that's up to the colleges then to then say, then to look at the students and say, well, this is a transgender student, this is a cisgender student. So that's not something that we can decide for them. That's up to them. And so maybe we need to have that discussion with whoever it is that gives out scholarships or things like that. But we're still talking about kids. Let kids be kids. Let kids play sports. Sports are fun. Let them do whatever. You know, it's growing. It's hard to grow up, especially if you're a transgender youth. So why take something away from them? Just let everybody do whatever they want. As long as they're not hurting themselves or others, I think anybody should do whatever they want.
I think I stayed about the same. I think that transgender students should go with their gender identity just because sports teaches you so much about leadership, it teaches you discipline. There's so many valuable lessons. I would not be the same person without it. And to say that they cannot participate in that or the thing that they wanted to do just further ostracizes them from society. And in Utah, we already have a lot of depression in LGBTQ youth, so much suicide rates. If we were able to uplift these individuals by any means possible, I think that their lives are more important than anything else.
So I want to go with stronger. I'm not going to be undecided anymore just because I need to hear the opposing side of the argument. And since I heard both sides, I know what side I'm on. I think I chose that side because I think about people that are transgender, like not people, well, youth transgenders that come from places that I come from, and they may possibly look like me, especially when you are a colored transgender youth. It is almost impossible for you to get into a school, let alone think about actually paying for education. So we talking about expanding resources and making resources available to everyone. We need to make those resources available to that type of population just because they don't have the same resources as everybody else. It is an unlevel playing field at all times, anywhere, any state you go to. It is not the same. You will not experience the same type of experiences that you are when you actually identify with the gender that you was actually born.
Sorry, I got the chair. One last time.
We'll see. Okay. Anyways, I guess I'm still staying in my position. I also think I'm just so brilliant. I think that we should look for a way that we have a choice to include those who want to, maybe a third category of everybody who wants to play the sports, and include both genders, and have a third group category or something like that. I don't know. Those who choose, but I do feel that there is still an unfair playing advantage when against kids of natural biology.
Last but not least.
Well, after this wonderful civil discourse, I've completely changed my ways, and I absolutely believe we need to let anybody who identifies at the K-12 level to being a girl to join the girls' teams. And so, thank you.
All right, well then in that case, why don't we go ahead and give our five volunteers another round of applause, and you all can return to your seats. You can leave your microphones in your positions as they are. So I'm going to take the last couple of minutes here to just sort of summarize the conversation as best as I can do it. So, we had a variety of different perspectives here today. Throughout that conversation, there were some themes that emerged that I'd just like to kind of unpack and then repackage up for next time. The first was fairness. We talked a lot about fairness. We talked about it from different perspectives. Is it fair for cisgendered girls to compete with trans girls? On the other side, is it fair to further isolate trans kids for the perception that we are doing right by cisgendered girls? We talked a lot about the extent to which, at what point do sports become competitive? Is it in middle school? Is it in high school? Do the majority of high school students go on to participate in collegiate athletes, and should that matter? We talked about the possibility of developing other or perhaps new categories for not just trans youth, but perhaps also non-binary youth or even cisgendered boys and girls to participate in something similar to co-ed. And lastly, we spent some time talking about the intersectionality of what it means to be a trans youth athlete. And that part must not be lost on us. I know that I personally specifically designed this statement in a way to make us focus on a very narrow element of the trans experience and of the youth experience and of this debate. We talked really only about HB 11, but it's also important to recognize that bills like this and conversations like these don't happen in a vacuum. There are many other factors to consider besides just whether or not somebody is trans in youth. We ended the conversation, December talked a little bit about resources and what it means to expand resources. And that can mean a variety of different things depending on your perspective. I know that that might not be the catch-all solution that we were hoping for, but the ambiguity is real and the conversation continues. So I want to thank you all for attending and participating and being respectful and kind to each other. And I hope to see you all next semester.
Great. Thank you, James. Give me a round of applause. A couple of things. A little political insight on HB 11. It passed the House. It's sitting in the Senate. The legislative session ends tomorrow. So it's on the calendar in the Senate. It hasn't fully passed as a law yet. A little fact checking. Addie was correct. She sent me a peer-reviewed article that I looked over, and I checked it with some other sources. It appears there is, after a year of hormone therapy, a bit of advantage. Sarah was correct when she said that the number of transgender youth is small. Studies showing it at 1.5 to 2%, something along those lines in high school. Thank you so much for this. Was a great Pizza Politics. Thanks again, James, and we'll see you guys at the student body election debates on Tuesday. Thanks again.